Hello there, welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. This is the second of two conversations with different people about the idea of voice in performance. Last time I spoke to Cian Donnelly, and this time I'm speaking to Emma Bennett. So Emma is an artist and academic working with performance and speech. She's a very brilliant performer and writer, and I have enjoyed some of her performances in person and via the internet. And she also writes really interestingly about performance. So she's currently working on a book about direct audience address in contemporary theatre. And that's why I wanted to speak to her, because I've been thinking a lot about artworks and artists that talk to their audience. She's an assistant professor in performance at University College Dublin. She's not all over the internet, but if you go to the UCD website, you can see her profile, and you can go on YouTube and find performances by her if you search her name and What Matter, which is a performance from about 6 years ago, or if you search for Emma Bennett Phonica, and you'll find a performance from about 9 months ago. So what did we speak about? Well, first I really asked her to define what direct audience address is for her, and that sends us off on an interesting conversation about the difference between direct address in, say, performance art, thinking about a kind of visual arts lineage of performance art, as opposed to theatre and experimental theatre, which really is Emma's specialism. We talk a bit about academic-y stuff, about how academic books happen and how they have to be planned and prepared and proposed. And we talk a little bit about the performativity of performance documentation, as in the way that performances are constituted through photos and videos and recordings. And that's actually in reference to a text by Philip Auslander, which you can find online. There's an interesting discussion about how Emma frames the notion of an audience. She frames this in an interesting way, thinking about theatre audience defined by the fact that they have kind of bought tickets and that they could be anyone, although we agree that in performance art and experimental theatre it's often not anyone, it's often the friends and family of the performers. Emma mentions a book by Hans Thiers Lehmann called The Post-Dramatic Theatre from 1999, which is interesting if anyone wants to know more about postmodernism in theatre. She mentioned some interesting theatre makers, so I'm just going to list them here just because people might want to look them up. So Travis Alabanza, Selena Thompson, Back to Back Theatre, Oisin McKenna, and Scotty. And then we spend a little bit of time at the end talking about ASMR, because Emma wrote a super interesting essay on ASMR, which again you can find online if you Google her name with ASMR. But first we speak a little bit about this idea of voice that I kind of imposed as a theme on these podcasts, and Emma explains how she both does and does not recognise what I'm talking about.
I work with my own voice, but I'm not sure the extent to which I work with the idea of voice. You know, so it almost feels like you just necessarily have to use your voice to speak. So, well, you know, maybe not necessarily, but so I sort of often get included in things about voice. I'm not sure I have anything to say about voice itself or really know much about it, you know?
Yeah, well, that's all my questions gone then. That's fine.
I'll just be like, yeah, I don't know.
I think that's what's interesting to me is that, you know, now I'm doing kind of PhD stuff, so I'm kind of placing myself in a field. And of course, if you're coming from a visual arts background, which I do, and you end up in performance, then actually speaking is not an assumed thing, right? It's not the most obvious thing to do when you're a performer. So artists who actually choose to speak or use language at all, even in text form or whatever, it's not natural in the way that it might be, or it's not a given in, or you know, naturalized in the way it might be in, I don't know, like other forms of performance or poetry, maybe, I don't know, or writing more generally.
Yeah, I think that, like, if you're talking about theatre, I guess that's my kind of catch-all term for things that happen on stage. You step onto that stage and there's, if you're within that tradition or in relation to it, there's just that question of how you're going to talk to the audience. How are you going to talk? How do these figures on this stage talk? And like, if you, from being a young artist trying to work out your relationship with it, the question of how you're going to talk is just always there. So it's interesting to contemplate art forms where you don't necessarily, where talking is not expected. That kind of sounds a bit wild to me. I'm sure there's performance makers, or, you know, coming from the theatrical tradition who don't have this hang up. Maybe it's just me, but definitely when I was starting out when I was young and I discovered the work of forced entertainment, it seemed like, and that was a big sort of key, opening a whole new way of thinking about theatre. But certainly in their early work, when they were coming to make theatre, their big question was, how do we talk? They kind of gibberish for the first few shows because they just couldn't work out how to do it. So the answer is to not really talk, just make noises.
Last time I saw you was in London, and I think you were living somewhere in London or around there, and now you're in Dublin. So maybe just tell us what you're doing in Dublin. And, you know, last time I saw you were doing lots of performing and writing, and now you're obviously writing a book, which seems to be more like writing about performance, perhaps. So maybe you could just kind of do a brief sketch of how you got to Dublin.
Okay, so I got to Dublin through applying for an academic job at University College Dublin that first of all was temporary. And so, like all these things, it's easier to make a big change when you think, well, I'll just go and try it for 3 years. And then the pandemic happened, and it felt like everything was slightly in jeopardy, and I better just hang on to this job with my, you know, nails digging into it. So yeah, I really put everything into getting the permanent version of my temporary job, which I did, luckily, and I'm very relieved about that. But at the same time, I'm slightly now thinking, oh God, what just happened? Now I've got this big job. So I've got a big full-time academic job, and part of going to Dublin was my partner is Irish, and I just thought it would be an interesting adventure to go and live where he's from rather than him living in the UK. So that was part of it. And then part of getting the permanent version of my job was, where's your monograph? You need a monograph, which is, you know, your academic single authored, single topic book that announces to the world what you are. So yeah, I decided to knuckle down and try and propose a very sensible academic book and go against form, which was always to try and go towards the least sensible version of academic research.
Because you're writing a book on direct address.
Yes, direct audience address. From my scattered publication record, you might be able to tell that I've rather avoided writing about theatre or even really performance, you know, in the kind of, I guess you call it kind of experimental theatre or performance, or some people call it performance theatre, but the sort of stuff I'm really interested in, I avoided writing about. I wrote about almost anything apart from that, which I can't fully explain why that is, but it was a moment of thinking, write about the thing that you properly know about and you've spent a lot of years working on already. And basically the common denominator of the stuff that I was interested in was that someone in some way talked to an audience. So that became the theme. And now that's becoming, you know, in academia, you almost have to have a trademark where it's like, what do you work on? Oh yeah, ding, 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 you know, here's your trademark. And mine is direct audience address. And as I go through the world and more people know that that's what I do and start to ask me about it, I feel like the less I know what it is and the less I have to say about it. You know, it's kind of direct audience address. You can't develop a general theory of it. It's not a unified thing. I mean, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, I really want to talk to you about that because I'm really interested in it." And then as I talk to them, I realize they have a completely different understanding of it than I do. And it's a broad term for a lot of practices that it maybe doesn't always make sense to think about in the same way.
So what's your angle on it, or what's your particular interest in it, or what's your basic definition of the part of it you're interested in?
Okay, let me try this because it shifts around all the time. I guess in a very broad way, I'm interested in theatre that acknowledges its theatre. Okay, so I guess then I'm turning to the medium, if theatre can be called a medium, not everyone will call it that, as, you know, the sort of thing that's being acknowledged in a direct audience address. It's like, look, I know I'm on a stage. I know you're an audience who are sitting in seats, and I know there's something conventionalized about this situation. So that's, I guess, a very immediate, basic way of defining it. And as I'm saying that to you, I'm like, but, you know, that doesn't stand up in all sorts of ways, because to acknowledge that the situation in the theatre is conventionalized is what does that really mean? Like are you trying to neutralize the formality? Are you trying to cut through and say, I know it's weird that you're over there and I'm over here and you've paid, but really we're all just humans. I'm over here. Are you trying to neutralize that situation, or are you trying to play it up and accentuate it? So as soon as you start to make generalizations about direct address and what characterizes it, what defines it, you start to find contradictions or variations. Yeah, so I guess the task of trying to make a proposal for a book, justify it being even a topic, is something I'm grappling with at the moment. You send your book off for peer review and people come back at you and say, this bit doesn't really make sense. Can you further justify that? What are you actually saying there? And really, as an academic, professionally, you're supposed to say, very good that you asked that, because... Whereas at the moment, I'm just feeling like, you're right. I shouldn't write it. It's a bad idea. It's bad. Forget it. I'll just go. So yeah, that's the stage I'm at right now.
That's interesting. So, I mean, this is obviously, I'm kind of weaving between the professional and the thematic stuff here, but so you have to get the proposal through before they kind of let you write the rest of the book.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, you should really be writing the book anyway. So then you can, because often people will have questions about a proposal and then you give them a chapter and they're like, oh no, I see what you mean.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
I think there's something about arguing that a book is a coherent proposition as an intervention in a field that's got a particular set of demands in the professional world of academia that is different than what my impulse is to do, is saying, here's a collection of thoughts. Here's a few essays. Here's a few moments of encounter that I had that I managed to develop some thoughts about that I've put into writing that I think you might want to read. I'm not saying a massive thing about the state of the world or the art form or the territory, the geographical area or the particular society or this historical moment. I might say a few things along the way, but I don't expect them to stand up to scrutiny. It just might be a moment where you encounter those thoughts too, and you take it and do what you want with it.
And that's not allowed.
Within the professional structures of academic publishing, it seems that that's very difficult unless you're already established thinker. And you can say, here's the things I've been working on for the last 10 years. They don't come together in a very obvious way, but each has, had its own impact, and here you go.
It's like when you're like 18 and you want to get a job in a bar and everyone's like, have you had any bar work experience? And you say, well, no, but that's what I'm trying to gain. The things that I have read of yours, the academic-y things that I've read of yours, they do all include direct audience address. I've read something about ASMR, something about Stuart Lee.
Yes.
And then something about birdsong, which is maybe slightly different actually, but the Stuart Lee piece and the ASMR piece were directly about direct address. But in the book, you trying to focus on things that call themselves theatre rather than obviously stand-up is a form, ASMR is a new form. Is that what you mean? You're going back to kind of directly talking about theatre or experimental theatre or something?
Yes, I'm trying to include that in a book that also includes stand-up comedy and ASMR. What you have with those latter two examples is mediation. Stand-up, I would propose, is formally, it has developed as a medium that lends itself to being recorded and broadcast. And the style of address is actually inseparable from its broadcastability.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that I'm being a little bit polemical maybe there, because the claims made for stand-up comedy are often that it's the most live of all of the live sort of performance genres because it has this sense of interaction with an audience. But I did a bit of work to try and understand how, without being very well trained or adept at historical research, trying to understand how stand-up comedy developed. And obviously, stylistically, stand-up comedy relies on a microphone and amplification hugely for its sense of timing, and also just the tone of the address being fairly intimate, fairly offhanded, and a lot of the comedians I like aren't standing there shouting at the audience. They're kind of, speaking in a normal volume and using sort of pauses in quite a subtle way. And that really relies on amplification. Amplification within one room is not what microphones were developed for, because there wasn't really a clear need for that. That only started to be done after microphones were being used to record voices or broadcast voices. And it's actually, as I understand it, people who know about this history might come and contradict me, and I would be fascinated if they did. But it was harder to develop ways to amplify within a room because of feedback.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And also, you can usually hear someone's voice in a room. You don't necessarily need electrical technology for, acoustic and vocal projection to enable the people in the room to hear one person in the room speaking. So it's not really an obvious thing to develop. So I began to think that what we understand are so many of the things that we associate with stand-up comedy, the microphone being was like the kind of emblematic thing, developed so that stand-up comedy could be on the radio, then on television. And that it's a live performance genre, and the liveness is important to it and fundamental to it. But the liveness exists as a quality that is, brought into focus and relief by its broadcastability or its recordability, and vice versa. The two have a kind of inseparable relationship.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes me think about maybe like the history of like rock and roll and stand-up and how they're kind of interwoven histories. Alternative comedy and, alternative comedians going on tour with punk bands, in the 80s or whatever. But then it also makes me think of that, Philip Auslander's little essay about the performativity of performance documentation.
Yes.
Because that for me is something I'm looking at quite a lot in terms of like OG performance art, like Carrie Schneeman or something, like amazing pictures of Meat Joy. And then I was watching the real, the video of Meat Joy, which nowadays is very easy to get, but when I was a student, you wouldn't have been able to get that. And actually it's like 45 minutes of like dancing around in pants. And then there's some meat at the end. But the pictures, the famous images are of this 5 minutes at the end with the meat. And like, that is the performance for a lot of people. And maybe there's something about stand-up, like you say, the liveness is constructed through, the old thing of the record, right? There would be a record sold of stand-up gigs, or so people could listen to it over and over and over again. That's super interesting. The other thing I was wondering was as well, because the way you described direct address a few minutes ago was the idea of referring to a convention by almost breaking that convention. Whereas the convention of stand-up is direct address, right? You begin with hello, you say hello. So you do that immediately. And I don't know how you would ever be able to break out of it. I suppose you can go into sketches or something. There's lots of sketch comedy that like breaks in and out of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's an interesting puzzle, because often if people have talked about or framed direct audience addresses in some way valuable or having like political value, for example, it's in breaking convention and I suppose breaking people out of their complacent passivity. Yes, I suppose the claims of stand-up comedy are almost that it doesn't need breaking, because there's a kind of there's a constant on your toesness on the part of the performer and the spectators. Everybody has to be more awake because anything could happen, which I don't think is true. I think it's highly conventionalized, just in a different way. And I think it's almost like there's an illusion of convention being broken, I guess, in jokes, because jokes are sort of rely on a little manageable shock or surprise repeatedly. But somebody who wants to kind of genuinely feel like they're transgressing, or kind of how did you phrase it really well? Exposing a convention by breaking it. I'm trying to think of when that genuinely happens. I mean, I feel really equivocal about, being associated with Stuart Lee and referring to him as some kind of bastion of all comedic innovation. But I suppose that's what drew me to try and write about his work in the first place, that he seemed to be calling attention to things that you're not really supposed to actually call attention to in stand-up comedy. I guess sort of notions of the audience's pretension in having gone to see this comedian specifically, or that there are different audiences within an audience, and some of them laugh and some of them showing how clever they are by laughing, and others are laughing in a different way at a joke that has multiple kind of levels at which you could access it. Yeah. And I think there are people who've written about Stuart Lee and said the reason that the stage Stuart Lee is really a tragic figure is that, he purports to be innovating and breaking the conventions and exposing and questioning the conventions of stand-up, but you can never really do that because it all gets enveloped back into stand-up comedy, because as long as it makes people laugh, they're satisfied, and it's not going to really change the world.
So in that sense, to think about this, we had an email conversation where it really made me laugh, when you said basically that direct address is often very annoying, right? Like in theatre, it is quite annoying when they kind of get that little smug look in their eye and they turn to the audience and start doing their direct address bit. But I suppose in stand-up, to use Stuart Lee as an example, he has his cake and eats it, where like he annoys the audience, but that leads to a kind of a laugh anyway, which then satisfies the audience. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that annoyingness of direct address. Why is it annoying when it happens?
Good question. And I think I would plead the thing I was saying at the beginning, in that it's difficult to make generalizations about direct address.
Give me an example then, because you did say this thing about it being annoying, and I thought that was a really interesting point, that like this thing that I'm really interested in and I use a lot, it is quite annoying, and it does lead to like antagonistic relationships between the audience and the performer, but not always in like a kind of cool political avant-garde way, often just in a like, oh yeah, get on with it way. Is there a good example that you can think of?
Well, I'll come on to my example in a minute. I wanted to just recall what you'd said in that email correspondence that I thought was really brilliant, which was about you're picking up on it, I guess, annoying the spectator or the audience, sort of almost as a strategy of the artwork or the artist in it. Almost, I think you were kind of intimating like an acknowledging the limitations of a supposed avant-garde sort of art form. Like, we know this is stupid and annoying, and this is what we're doing with it. And I think, and you mentioned punk, and I think there's some alignment there as well. Like, we're going to be stupid and idiotic and take this, I think you can do a lot with that, and I often enjoy not enjoying that as a spectator. So then you're sort of in the question of like, when do I get genuinely irritated and angered and exasperated by direct audience address? In watching recent things, it sometimes can happen when I feel that the artist, the theatre maker, or the show, whatever seems to be talking to us, doesn't want to give us enough space to work out our own relationship with the work. So it's explaining a little bit too much about what things are supposed to mean, or how things are supposed to feel, or how they're supposed to land, and not fully sort of... I'm really annoyed with myself for coming to this, because I would read people complaining about direct audience address in some of the ways that I am doing now and about to do, and think, how conservative, oh my goodness, like, you're like, but I'm beginning to have, maybe some of those tendencies, in that I want the artists to trust the art form and to trust the spectator and just let it do it, and I think there's certain things about I'm beginning to reflect now on, are there certain contexts of making work and work being commissioned and shown, within particular scenes, or like, funding situations, where A, you have a certain amount of time to do something and it's probably not enough time. B, there's a certain sort of expectation set up about what you give the audience in terms of like a sort of transactional thing. Like, they've come out and I need to not give them a few half-formed ideas. I really need to tell them that this has relevance, and ideally maybe the show would do that without explaining it literally. But if you run out of time, the thing you have to do is just explain it. You have to say what we're trying to do here, so come with us. And I think that can really rub people up the wrong way if you're like, hi, so we're trying to make this show, and it's really about, say it's about, in the past, we've all gone through this experience with COVID, so how do we think about that? And it really tells you what it's about, and it's like, could you not just let us work out that it might have that resonance, possibly, if it had? But I've come, I guess I'm kind of coming at this from someone who now is involved in a very specific theatre making scene in Dublin. It's, you know, it's very rich, it's very interesting, not rich financially, but I mean, it's there's lots of really interesting work happening and people willing to support experimental stuff and support one another, and there's a great community feel. At the same time, you know, I don't think people have long enough with their work. And I think that there's, you know, it's also really, really hard because it's a small scene. So the kind of risk of failure is differently. I'm still trying to get to grips with it, but the risk of failure and it not coming across enough and not being deemed not enough. Like, actually, I refer back to my own experience as a younger emerging performance maker. And we did a show and it was supposed to be a huge premiere in Berlin. We thought it was a good idea not to explain anything, to have hardly any words in it, you know, just be. So all the things I'm saying I want. And it was so bad. The audience did not understand what was going on and they sort of hated it and hated us. And the programmer who had commissioned it afterwards said, we said, what's wrong with the show? And he said, it's not really a show. And I think that fear, when you're in a kind of precarious situation and there's so much at stake, you want the thing to definitely be a show. It's like, is it a show? Is it enough? Is it a show? And I think I'm kind of perhaps reacting in a sort of frustrated way for our art form of the, you know, experimental theatre, in that we're in a situation where it's so difficult to make a show that you might be so scared that it's not even a show, that you put everything in that you possibly can. You put the not direct bits and you put the bits that are supposed to be beautiful and figurative and mysterious, but you also explain that so that they're sure that there's enough that, you know, this is a thing. I have thought about this. There's ideas here. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And, yeah, that's where I am with it most recently. And perhaps that's to do also with my job in supporting people to become theatre makers, that I'm like, how do you kind of frame your entire practice and your entire project to an audience who, if you're working in the theatre, are like not quite the general public, but they kind of have to equate with the general public, you know, ticket holders.
Yeah, that's super interesting. See more and more, because do you know Dan Oliver?
Yes.
Yeah. So Dan, I work with Dan and have done for a while, and we have this conversation back and forth because he kind of comes from a theatre-y background and I definitely don't, and I come from an art background, and we hit on these points of difference. You know, essentially we're interested in the same stuff, but occasionally we hit on these points of difference that I can only explain through, like, being trained in like drama and theatre stuff, or just not doing that and coming to performance from a different route. And I suppose that's I wonder, what am I getting at now? I've kind of lost my thread. My ultimate point, and I'm not now going to be able to join these two things up, is that I suppose with a lot of performance art, it is bad and it's not very good. And a lot of the audience, which is not a general audience and no one's paying for any tickets, come away from it and are like, what was that about? Yeah. But that's just very common. That's like not strange or uncommon at all, is to be at an opening or something and there to be some performance art and you'd be like, oh, I didn't know there was performance on. And then you look at it for like 10 minutes and you're like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I don't know if, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I wonder if like the conventions that are being broken or being set up or the interplay of conventions, maybe without having to resort to this idea of breaking, or maybe they're just different conventions. And I'm often thinking about the conventions of performance art, which is that it doesn't really matter if you annoy the audience to the point where they walk out, because then that's just futurism or something.
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose there is like the notion of failure or whatever. Yeah, like not managing to have made a show, like being told that you haven't managed to do it. Whereas like that wouldn't make any sense in a performance, because like if you've done the performance and you're drinking a beer afterwards, like that has happened, and that's probably the last time and the first time you'll ever do that performance.
Yeah.
Whereas theatre has that thing of like, you're going to make this, you're going to workshop it and develop it and then turn it into something that can be looked at over and over again.
No, this makes such a lot of sense to me. And I think that, I don't know, were you saying that with Daniel, having some background in theatre, he finds it difficult sometimes to be in that position of doing a thing that's like, what was that?
To be fair with Dan, I think our interests are, without speaking for him. Generally, we're into similar stuff. This is just, I never thought about the fact that there's two strands of performance-y people, right? And one of them went to like drama clubs and one of them didn't. And it's funny that they're kind of rubbing along often in the same venues or going to see the same stuff. Daniel has opinions on theatre. He has opinions on like mainstream plays and stuff because he teaches it. He he has to teach kind of intro courses to it, and he has to convince theatre kids to try and do live art.
Yeah.
So he's got to sell it in a different way. Whereas like, I don't really want my students to do performance art because they'll just do it. I'll just have to watch it.
Yeah.
And that's like weirdly, that's an acceptable position as an art someone who teaches art to have, in a way that obviously it wouldn't make any sense if you were trying to stop your students from doing the thing that you are meant to be training them to do.
I mean, this makes so much sense to me, though, what you're saying about, performance art approach and the thing going on the gallery, and it's, you've not bought a ticket for it. It's not been advertised as the thing that's happening. And it's not necessarily not been what it's supposed to be if it doesn't produce particular...
That's it, isn't it? Yeah.
...emotions or meanings for the spectators, and that, I think that this is fault line that a lot of people like me perhaps work along. That I have this impulse to do something weird, people not know my name and just leave, but then I have a wish to really satisfy people. I mean that's the simplest and most generalized way I can say it, to satisfy people, and that might be through, making them really laugh, making them think a bit. But in general, that, that programmer who said it's not really a show, he was like, it's not satisfied my expectations of a show or of my evening, And I think that all those kids who come to study drama have that as their kind of underlying value. Sometimes they're very animated and almost vitriolic if they go to see something and it's not satisfied them, or it's not satisfied their expectation of what a night at the theatre should provide. And it's very hard to get them to just like, they're basically writing an essay that said that shouldn't have happened. And you're like, well, it did happen, but I think that if you come from that and then you've stayed in that sort of world to a certain extent, and now I'm on the other side and I'm teaching it and I'm trying to get them to draw back from it a bit. But I guess we're talking about conventions, but as you were saying that, I was also thinking about conditions, so we're talking about the conditions in which something is produced and put out to whatever publics or, are going to encounter it. And maybe why I've kind of turned to theatre in my book is that if I'm going to do a performance in a gallery, I think I still bring the imaginary conditions of a theatre show with me. So even though these people haven't bought a ticket for it or might be on a mixed bill and they're not really expecting to necessarily be satisfied in the same way, I want to actually do that for them and surprise them that happened. Like, oh, I actually enjoyed that. Wow. Yeah, I got then interested in what an audience is who have bought tickets. So they have that relationship with what they're seeing, that they've bought it, they've bought in to whatever is going to happen.
So in that situation, maybe I'll pose this and you can tell me how close it is. Is the annoyance of direct address often from ticketed people because they bought something and they just, Nicholas Rido's thing of like people sitting in the dark watching other people work. And then when direct address happens, they're kind of being asked to do a little bit of work or something. Is that something close to it?
Oh, that's really interesting. I know we have a shared love of Sayan Nai. And I'm thinking of her gimmick theory a little here in that maybe it's that you're being asked to do a bit of work, but maybe it's that you think the people haven't done their work properly,
yeah, suddenly like you're aware that they haven't tried hard enough, or it's offered quite a lot but actually it's not done the work that's necessary.
There's certainly like some more traditionalist critics of drama who are all into the show don't tell, and that it's more refined, subtler, it's harder work. You need it's much more, requires much more technique and training to show dramatically and allow the audience, so this is why I've got concerns about my newfound irritation at certain forms of direct address, like, don't make it obvious, don't make it literal, dramatize, and then, whatever kind of significances or authorial intentions are in that, the will come across or will not, but you have to kind of leave it somewhat for the spectators to decide what's going on. Whereas if you come on stage and say, hi, I know this is a play and this is what we're trying to do, that, you're failing in all sorts of ways. You're not doing your job properly. And you're also trying to kind of get a bit of coolness in terms of being transgressive or metafictional or self-aware in a way that's unearned, so gimmicky. It's a device that's supposed to show that you're edgy, but really it shows that you're just not doing the work. So I think that's a traditionalist drama criticism way to be disgusted by direct audience address or irritated by it.
Disgusted is good. That's a good, strong
which
word.
I don't share, but I'm interested in that.
There's also, it's too late or something for it to be transgressive anymore, right? Like maybe I'm now thinking more about, I'm just in my head for some reason, I've gone to kind of novels, and a lot of people's annoyance at kind of auto-fiction is a misunderstanding of it as somehow doing deconstruction or doing bad postmodernism or something, when maybe it's just a recognition of the constructedness of memoir or something like that. And I don't know why it needs a new name, but it does. But yeah, like there is, if you read kind of high postmodern novels now, like they are really irritating. Like it's really irritating that Thomas Pynchon writes lots and lots of made up songs in his novels, and you're like, am I meant to read this? Am I meant to like read through it? And I suppose if you tried to do that now, it would be cringe, wouldn't it? That would be the word that people would use for it. Because it hasn't got any of those transgressive qualities at all. Because Fleabag happened, and so everyone's seen it or something,
Yeah.
Is there a genuine misunderstanding that there's the possibility of breaking out of the conventions of theatre, or is it just a happiness that there's a different set of conventions that you can kind of bring in and out? Like,
I think happiness is a nice way to describe it. Like, there's a term that emerged in theatre studies and got an awful lot of traction and still does, which is the post-dramatic.
Right.
And it wasn't coincident with postmodern. It was published. It was first sort of posited by a German theatre theorist called Hans Thies Lehmann in 1999. But it was the idea that a turn to direct address marked the emergence of something after drama, like a different approach. And I guess Lehmann then was looking back at a lot of things that we would call postmodern and naming it differently for theatre studies. I think there was a sense, now I come at this through like theatre, and I guess as much of the history of experimental theatre that I know and familiar with, but the kind of postmodern era that I associate with what you're talking about in Pynchon is a sampling of a lot of different types of address and different forms, and a kind of switching between them and putting them next to one another. So, and in all of that, it was striking, I'm thinking back again to the work of Force Entertainment, but also the Worcester Group who influenced them. And in all of that, it was striking that they were sampling different modes of address from different mediums and different genres, and in all the while never quite addressing anyone, you're not really sort of being addressed. It's about the idea of a distanced, impossible audience, and that kind of, never quite properly communicating anything because there's an excess of forms of communication. And I think in moving away from that, which that's no longer kind of the thing. It's no longer really trendy. I guess autofiction is an interesting emergence to compare to some of the stuff that I've seen in theatre, where, perhaps it's also a bit of an influence of live art coming back into the theatre, where theatre makers who really identify as writers, so like Travis Alabanza or Selena Thompson, real proper writing, crafted, beautiful texts, play with the situation of a theatrical performance. And I using theatrical really advisedly there, because I think what I was saying about the conditions of it being in a setting that you could equate with, a public forum where people have bought tickets, and maybe it crosses over a bit with a sort of marketplace or a public sphere in that way. So the people who come to the theatre are strangers who are there because they've bought a ticket. They might happen in real terms to actually be your friends or other artists or people you know, but you have to address them as if they're a theatrical public, whoever they are, because that's what the thing is and that's what the writing does. So I'm not sure what I'm saying about that in general, but I think that it just, what you said about autofiction kind of sparked it differently for me. And maybe it's not necessarily a breaking with conventional tradition that's in love with its own breakingness. It really has a sort of motivation, a sort of need to do that, to find ways of addressing issues or addressing publics and be seen to be doing that.
Is it about naming a topic or something? I mean, I'm just thinking of me and Dan went to see Back to Back, actually. Back to Back Theatre. And it was great. It's the first time I've seen them. And I just really enjoyed it. And the show did a brilliant mixture of like naming the themes and also addressing them through, you know, drama and comedy and like, you know, stories. And it was such a brilliant bit of theatre. But there was also like a little talk at the end. And the talk was really strange because it just renamed all the stuff that had been addressed in the piece, but in a way that made it a bit like too obvious. But then that also made me feel a bit like a snob or something. Like, what I don't want them to actually talk about, you know, like, I can't remember what the specific issues they're raising, but issues about disability in Australia, in Britain, in the world at large. Like, why can't I also like let the people on stage like also talk about those issues in a more general sense? But it felt like it ruined it for me or something. I don't know.
I know what you mean. And I think it like in some way comes back to, you know, that question of like aesthetic appreciation or judgment. And I've not quite got my head around this yet, but, you know, and I guess speaks again to what I was talking about, kind of the expectations that something will satisfy certain sort of criteria to be a show. And, you know, you could say with the works that we're referencing here, there's, you know, questions of, you know, historical marginalization or like, you know, actually like severe sort of oppression and genocide, you know, like racial capital, or, you know, sustained discriminatory violence, and like gender-based violence. And these are the histories and the present conditions being addressed by these interventions. But in that, I was saying, you know, like a lot of these artists do beautiful, crafted, composed writing or really smart, considered interventions in, you know, theatrical conventions and stuff, you know, but maybe, yeah, that's still giving, you know, so when I talk about the spectator in this context, I suppose I'm talking about in whatever context we're talking about, these artists are addressing this issue in a public forum to the public. That's kind of being figured as a social totality that can be kind of figured as an unmarked body in some way, but not everyone can equally occupy that body.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So that if you are a person who can occupy that unmarked sort of position in whatever way, maybe this is a very Baroque way of making this point, but maybe it needs to be like maybe it having kind of some aesthetic value to you, some cleverness, some beauty, just allows you get out, you know. You know, that's like the other position. You get to be elevated as a kind of, I'm being elevated and improved by this, aren't I good, you know? Aren't I good to be giving this my attention? And I think all these artists are really wise to that, and include moments where that's acknowledged and pushed against. You know, certainly, because I'm thinking as well about a great show by an Irish performance maker called Oisin McKenna, called Admin, that's a sort of like a kind of monologue, like autofiction, I guess. You know, it seems to be his story. Is it his? We assume so. He's the one telling it. You know, and these are all scenes that like describing everyday scenes of struggle, you know, abuse or trauma. And I kind of became aware that as a spectator, I was really investing a lot of hope in this moment in the theatre being a kind of corrective and a healing moment, and that my attention to this narrative would be helping this person. Now I'm listening. So, maybe you're okay now. That kind of like logic of exception where this person, through being so eloquent, having made it to this performance festival to tell this story in this space, it means they've transcended those circumstances. And me as the spectator, am part of that moment. So I'm really looking forward to giving them a standing ovation at the end, and they'll smile, and we all know it's okay. And Oisin McKenna very interestingly refused the curtain call, just walked off. Clapping, going, I'm going to let us be friends with you now. And he's like, I've done my work, I'm off. And I think those moments of challenge to those conditions of like the theatrical situation as a potential kind of space in which the public can sort of invest hope in their own attention as a kind of healing force.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I was just thinking again back to the pieces of yours that I've read, this idea of the spectator, the unmarked body or something. That doesn't tend to be the way that you have written about audience in those pieces, where you the writer, are the spectator.
Yeah.
I'm thinking you're writing very specifically about your experience of watching and rewatching Stuart Lee, or watching these ASMR videos, or of course performing and having to read through these texts that you've written of Birdsong. Is that like a go-to way of writing for you, where you really inhabit a specific position as a spectator, or are you trying now to write more about this general audience that is posited in theatre?
Good question. I think I'm still working it out. I think those pieces you're talking about I wrote a few years ago, and that was what I was doing then. And I think that these shows and these artists that we're talking about now, like, and back-to-back theatre as well, have challenged me to, try and be more rigorous about how I understand my own positionality. And I guess that's bringing me back to the theatre, because I'm not in any way kind of invested in that really old idea of theatre as a space of democracy, But at the same time, I do think that I noticed that there's something that the theatre context, or the set of conditions of a theatre as a place to go and speak and tell a story or create a situation through, rhetorical situation through addressing spectators in a certain way, that it does have a certain kind of function for artists who have a political intervention to make that's different to other spaces. Like Scotty, say, like I followed his career for quite a while and saw him in club settings doing, when he used to be sick and stuff. And, that was a really different relationship with the audience than when I go to see him in a theatrical setting, even if it's not literally in a theatre. Like Bravado, his piece was staged in, when I saw it in Leeds, it was in a working men's club. And I think it's also been in a boxing club and, those traditionally kind of masculine working class spaces. But still, it had like a mode of address that seemed to be speaking to us as like in a way that kind of felt like it was a theatrical situation, in that we're strangers and we're occupying a position of a kind of general public, like anyone could have bought that ticket in a kind of marketplace of the public sphere. Like I might dial back from this in the future. I'm just kind of exploring it a bit, that there's something particular about, perhaps even something that comes back to ideas of oratory, that it's really important to be addressing a general public, even if the people in the room aren't really that. that you, part of what you're seeing is that it's possible to address this in a public sphere. Yeah, so I'm thinking this through now, and then you need to kind of ask who can occupy the position of a general public, and to what extent do my interpretive moments depend on my ability to coincide with certain kind of somatic norms, to like quote Nirmal Puar's idea of, like who fits the kind of traditional sort of body of a certain position, But this is very much in progress, this thinking, I have to say. It's kind of just coming also from that really practical question of how do you write about it.
Could we talk about ASMR?
Yeah.
Because it struck me earlier what you were talking about, success, satisfaction, and audience relationships. And ASMR is so interesting because it's purely about satisfaction, but you can also kind of presume that quite a lot of people won't watch the videos all the way through to the end.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
like, it's both satisfying and also like doesn't satisfy the norms of how something being satisfying would normally work for like other art forms.
Yeah.
Maybe that's obvious because it's YouTube, but maybe you could talk to that a little bit because it seems to be doing something slightly different with direct address.
That's really interesting. So yeah, you wouldn't watch it all the way through. It's not going to have a dramatic arc, or narrative sort of propulsion, or that many twists. They might kind of be divided up in terms of props, or different, you get timestamps so that you could fast forward to the bit, or you can just kind of slide along because it's like, oh, she's going to do a whole chewing bit. I need to wait till the chewing bit's over, or I don't like this prop, or she's doing the bit with the light. I'm not really up for that right now. And you wait till it's going, no, I just want hand movements, just hand movements, so you can kind of select which bit you want, but they're all on a kind of continuum where they just offer it like a menu, they're just options. But I think when I get on a kind of, on my most sort of, almost like my worst bingey ASMR where I'm just watching the beginnings of 10 videos, and it's like more different. I kind of think what I want is just the novelty of a different person addressing me. I would just want to be able to, and it's not anything that you can necessarily separate out, because a lot of people say, oh, ASMR is just about the voice. It's not about what they're saying. Is it just about no, it's the whole thing. It's the mode and manner. It's the way they appear to me. It's the quality of their gaze. It's just the kind of like quality of their presence. And I guess the illusion of their attention to me, which they're not really paying attention to me. And I just want, it's just that encounter with that novelty and just the kind of all of that package that's kind of stimulating me in that way, just the sudden social stimulation of a whole different face and, manner and voice and presence. And that can just do it. It's just differentness. And then they're going to get out each different prop or, start sort of banging on about their life philosophy, which a lot of them do. And then I'm like, no, just different, just new encounter, and it's like, who's next? So yeah, I kind of feel like I get right down into just, the sheer particularity of a person and how it is to, because it's quite, that whole thing when you are introduced to someone and then afterwards you're like, what's your name again? Because I never remember a name because I'm too massively overstimulated by the sheer encounter with your physical presence.
I don't put it like that, but yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Well, that's how it feels to me often. It's just like a whole new person to compute and like try and just respond to and work out how I should appropriately look and smile and whatever, and then sometimes I've been talking to someone during the day and it's only when I get home or, sometimes I text them afterwards and go, oh, by the way, I liked that thing you did with your hair. But it was just like, I was talking to you and we were talking about something and I was totally gripped and absorbed by what we were talking about. But I only realized afterwards that at the same time, I was like looking at that person's eyebrows and thinking, have they done something different with their eyebrows? And it was just total parallel thought. And I suppose that level of kind of multi-track kind of engagement with a person's whole appearance to you in social space, I get one of the things I'm getting from ASMR is kind of a chance to just revel in just that without having to do any of the social stuff to answer it or participate in it and or learn their name or, like there's going to be no follow-up. I don't have to answer them. I don't have to go, oh, sorry, what did you say? Because I was just looking at the way your mouth moved. You just get to just do that.
And is direct address in that situation, it just happens to be the mode in which that kind of presence can be forefronted or something?
I think it must be that the direct address mimics a face-to-face social encounter. And that, because it's hard to remember somebody's name when you're being introduced to them, because I think it would be easier to remember someone's name if you were watching that person and they weren't engaging with you directly face to face with eye contact. And someone just said, by the way, that's Carol. Look at Carol. Watch how Carol speaks to people, and you'd be like, oh yeah, that is Carol. The fact that Carol's suddenly looking at me and I have to answer Carol makes me not be able to properly meet Carol. Do you know?
Yeah.
Oh my God. I think I'm probably sounding like very maladjusted right now, but I guess it's a way that perhaps a lot of people feel maladjusted.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the thing I got with, I was looking at ASMR a bit, and then there's a podcaster called it's called Sleep With Me, the podcast. This guy called Drew, I can't remember. He does these long droning podcasts where he just kind of talks about things in a dreamlike way, and his tone is very consistent, and the stories don't go anywhere, or they don't make any sense, or he goes off on tangents, and they last about 2 hours or something, and people use it to fall asleep, and that's the explicit thing. And what I noticed, I was just listening to them because I was interested, not because I was using them to go to sleep. But what I noticed was that when he started to accidentally construct a narrative that felt genuine or something, that would be frustrating and kind of slightly irritating. And I wondered, maybe that's a similar thing to you flicking through these ASMR things, where like as soon as they actually get into the business of like, oh, I'm going to do this particular thing now with the hairbrush or whatever it is, or I'm going to start talking in a way that's more specific, you kind of have to decide whether you like it or not, and that isn't really why you're there. Like you don't want to like that person in the ASMR situation, and I don't want to like or not like the story that this guy tells.
So you don't like it when he starts to tell an actual story, what, because you're too hooked in, or that you're put in the position of having to make a judgment?
Yeah, well, I was wondering what it was, because I don't use them to get to sleep, but I guess that what people like about his, because what he normally does is construct a tone that's very, very consistent, or actually more like a vibe, to use that word, that just stays the same and is like held, and you're held in it. And the vibe is the vibe of being told a story, but without the content of there being an actual story being told. So when there's accidentally moments when a story is actually being told, like that actually breaks the vibe of being told a story, because you just want the vibe and you don't want the content.
Yeah.
ASMR definitely has something in that as well, right? Because you don't want to actually go to the doctors, but it is quite nice when they like hold your arm or whatever.
I think that's one of the like most accurate ways of talking about what I like about ASMR that I've heard. Like it's the vibe of going to the doctor. I don't want to really go to the doctor. So if they start to some doctor role plays, I like it when they maintain the vibe, so there's something like generic enough just to pass as
really okay
doctorish talk. But if sometimes they get really specific, and they're like, so I've been looking at your chart, and you do have a skin condition. I can see you've got flaky bits under your eye. It's like, oh no. Maybe that's my equivalent, because like, don't make it don't make it so detailed that I'm suddenly in it, kind of intimate. And I really like, I think what I'm fascinated by and addicted to is people catching like something of the manner of address. And then when you get into particular ASM artists, it's because I like their particular manner of address. And now it no longer kind of reminds me so much of the way people in shops talk. It's more just the way that ASM artists talk.
Exactly.
But, I like it. Like some of them have really bizarrely accentuated ways of saying certain words, or, and I think often that started off in a sort of imitation of a generic kind of service, sort of sector customer service type address, or like, I'm looking after you or my client kind of address. And then it kind of got like into the feedback loop of ASMR community on YouTube, and it got more and more particular to what it was, until now we're at the stage where they have these long sign-ins and they do the same gesture and they make like the kind of thing, and then they have certain words that they say in certain ways, and people are putting in the comments, I love how you say good, that's be brave, be you, good, like, and now she says it all the time because people have said, I love how you say good. And I've entered ASMR world, which things go really, really down this wormhole.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for listening to that. I thought that was such a nice conversation. It gave me a lot to think about in terms of my own work. So thanks to Emma for taking part. She's a very generous interviewee, like all interviewees, to give up her time and talk to me. And I will be back very soon with a new series of podcasts with Andrea Franchi, all about sculpture. All right, be brave, be you. Good.